So, this particular topic, bearing its importance, is going to be an ongoing and building topic as we move through this class. I will continue to load up additional uh, independence related videos throughout the entire term, probably, of this class. As things become a little bit more applicable, also as those questions arise in class. So, we had a few very specific ones here as we were coming in to begin with. The first one dealt with, the financial interests and uh, how do we define these financial interests? To start with, we have indirect, and then we have beneficial ownership. If a covered member has or is committed to acquire, so remember, it's not only do you not only is it if you have it, if you actually have some type of a formal commitment in order to grab something, to acquire something, and it, whether material or not, or any material indirect financial interest in the test client, your independence is deemed to be impaired. So let's think about that for a second. Um, if a covered member has any material indirect financial interest in an ed test client, if a covered member is committed to acquire any direct material or any direct financial interest in an ed test client, independence is deemed to be impaired. Financial interests that are not impaired only happen if they are both indirect and immaterial. So let's look at some of these definitions a little bit more strongly. Your financial interest would be any ownership or an obligation to obtain ownership in equity, debt, or derivatives that are issued by an entity. They are direct if they are owned directly by, even if managed by others, if they are under one's control, even if managed by others, and if beneficially owned through an investment vehicle, estate, trust, or other intermediary, when the beneficiary either controls the intermediary or has the authority to supervise or participate in said intermediary's investment decisions. Now, you see underneath the direct, it's actual ownership or control. Indirect. So it's very easy to just assume that there's probably a direct relationship naturally, unless uh, an indirect definition comes into play. Now, an indirect financial interest is an interest that is beneficially owned through an investment vehicle, estate, trust, or other intermediary. So it has to be owned through something else. Um, when the person who is going to benefit from it, so when you, as the owner, doesn't have control of the intermediary, um, but or when you don't have control of the intermediary and when you do not have the authority to supervise or participate in its investment decisions. So your control is not applicable at all. You have no control over that investment vehicle's decisions and routes of investment. Now, we talked about, I mentioned beneficial ownership there, kind of a passing thing. This happens when an individual or an entity is not the record owner, but has the right or some right to all of the underlying benefits of ownership. This could be directing voting, disposing of interests, and receiving its economic benefits. So beneficial ownership really is how that young auditor impaired her independence, because she was receiving its economic benefits. She made the decision whether or not to dispose of the interest. And although she wasn't doing the voting, she would have been directing the voting because she had somebody buy it for her. And typically, financial interest rules are going to apply to covered members. But if a partner or a professional employee of the firm is not considered a covered member, that person and his or her immediate family or any group of such persons acting together, so joint membership, partnerships, cannot own more than 5%. So here is this 5% rule coming into play. Cannot own more than 5% of a client's ownership interests without impairing independence. Now, I think we kind of had a little bit of an issue raised. Like what if you don't know? What if you received something perhaps through gift or inheritance? I know we did kind of have a little bit of a uh, reference, or we were tiptoeing around maybe this kind of a subject. If you are a covered member and you receive or you learn, you will receive what's called an unsolicited financial interest. So you didn't go out and buy it, but you are going to receive it in an ed test client um, that is either direct interest or a material indirect interest. Your independence will not be impaired if you take this step. You have to dispose of it as soon as it's practicable, but not later than 30 days after having both the knowledge of the interest and gaining the right to dispose of it. So you can be aware that it exists, but you can't dispose of it if it is not your interest. It's important that you not participate in a test engagement after learning of that interest and before disposing of it. So, if you have entered into an ed test engagement and then you learn about this, then you must disengage from that particular engagement because you are impaired until you get rid of it, basically. But they don't automatically slap you for having been on the team uh, with your independence having been theoretically and in appearance impaired um, if you did not have the knowledge of it. Once you obtain that knowledge, then you must disengage and you have 30 days once you have the right to dispose of that particular interest to get it disposed of. Now, for most of us at this particular stage, and most of you, I'd say you're starting to think about your 401k plans, your simple IRAs, your mutual funds, all of these things that you probably have at least small interest of ownership in, but you don't always necessarily know what things are invested in. So here comes that 5% rule again, right? A covered member who owns shares in a mutual fund. So this is direct ownership in mutual fund shares. Is considered direct in the fund itself if they own 5% or less of the outstanding shares of the diversified mutual funds. So we know mutual funds are like baskets of stocks that are balancing for a purpose. So if it's 5% or less of the outstanding shares of the diversified mutual fund, your interest in the underlying investments of that fund is considered indirect. If it is immaterial and indirect interest, then your independence is not considered impaired. But if you own more than 5% of that diversified fund shares, um, or you own a financial interest in what is called an undiversified fund, Then you have to evaluate the fund's underlying investments. You have to look at them and say, how do they stack up and how do they comprise this fund to determine whether or not you hold a material indirect financial interest in any of the individual underlying investments. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. So, as an illustration of this, if a non diversified mutual fund owns shares in client company A, the mutual fund's net assets are 10 million. The covered member owns 1% of the outstanding shares of the mutual fund, having a value of $100,000. And the mutual fund has 10% of its assets invested in company A. So remember, this is a non diversified fund. So the 5% threshold doesn't exist. That's only in a diversified fund. The indirect financial interest of the covered member in Company A is $10,000. This is 10% of the mutual fund assets, the equivalent of his 1% of the outstanding shares, and it will be measured against that member's net worth. And this is going to include the net worth of his or her immediate family to determine materiality. So, like I said, it can get very complicated. But because there's such a degree of importance on independence, it's very important that you be aware of what you own, what the nature of it is. Is it diversified or undiversified? What are the underlying investments in that? If it's undiversified, or if you own more than 5% of a diversified fund. Now, if a member or their immediate family members self direct their investments into such a plan or have the ability to supervise or to participate in decisions, then the interests that are held by that plan are considered direct, that impair independence even if they are immaterial, because there's that control factor, right? There's that ability to direct, that ability to make the decisions. Now, if they don't self-direct, they don't supervise the plan, um, the underlying investments are considered indirect. So they don't create any type of an independence issue unless they're deemed material. So then that comes down to how much does this represent to my entire net worth? So that really talks about mutual funds, which for the most part, we're talking about IRAs, educational funds, 401ks. They're all very much invested in mutual funds. A defined benefit plan is a little bit different. So this is instead of I'm going to put away $5,000 a year, it's going to earn interest, I'll eventually draw on it. A defined benefit plan is another plan that is investing funds, but when you turn 60 or whatever the age may be, then you're going to get X amount of money from it up to so many years or death, depending upon the nature of the defined benefit plan. This is the traditional pension plan, as most of us know it. Interests that are held by these types of plans are not interests that are held by the members unless that member or their immediate family members are trustees of the plan or have the ability to supervise, participate, make decisions. So they are not considered uh, an involved interest unless they actually can have some control of direction. And employee stock options. Some of us have received, rights to employee stock options at some point. uh, of employment if we've worked for very large organizations. Those are considered beneficially owned by a member, uh, but are indirect until they have the right to dispose of them. At that point, then they become direct financial interests. And then that is going to determine whether or not you have to dispose of the asset in order to protect your independence in an engagement. As I said, we are going to cover a lot of different topics in regards to independence. And so far, I think we've got about an hour's worth of different discussion here that have dealt with independence. And we are just barely cracking the ice. Um, I will continue to load some of these up, and they will be there for you to access as we move through the class.